Margaret Collins seemed like the perfect wife, and Daniel Collins the devoted husband. But when secret love affairs, hidden poisons, and $1 million life insurance policy collided, their picture-perfect life exploded into a deadly game, where only one of them would walk away alive. In the quiet suburb of Eastwood, Margaret Collins lived in a home that seemed almost too perfect. The white picket fence, the well-kept garden, and the neatly painted shutters gave the impression of stability and peace. Neighbors would often wave when she passed, believing her life was as calm and orderly as the exterior of her house. She was known for her work as an art teacher at the local high school, a woman who brought creativity and patience into the lives of her students. Her husband, Daniel Collins, was a respected financial advisor, meticulous in his work and devoted, at least in appearance, to his wife. Together, they were the couple people used as an example of success. But behind closed doors, their marriage was unraveling in silence. The first cracks appeared in ways only a watchful eye could detect. Margaret began returning home later than usual, offering vague explanations about errands or school meetings. She was more guarded with her phone, tilting the screen away from Daniel's view. There were small changes too. Her perfume became heavier, her clothes more fitted, her hair styled with more care. Daniel, buried in work, noticed but chose not to react, convincing himself it was nothing more than a phase. Yet something inside him began to stir, a quiet unease he couldn't quite ignore. The turning point came on an ordinary Tuesday. Daniel received an unmarked envelope at his office. Inside were photographs, grainy but clear enough to leave no doubt. Margaret was pictured in the embrace of another man. The setting appeared to be a secluded park just outside of town, where they sat on a bench, leaning close in a way that was unmistakable. The man was Ethan Price, their neighbor from 3 houses down. Ethan was in his early 30s, good-looking, and known for his charm. Daniel had spoken to him only a handful of times, never suspecting that he would become the central figure in his marriage's undoing. Shock quickly gave way to a cold, simmering anger. Daniel didn't confront Margaret immediately. He placed the photographs in his desk drawer and went about his evening as if nothing had happened. His mind, however, had shifted into a different mode. He began to observe her more closely, memorizing her routines, noting the excuses she gave. He followed her once, keeping a careful distance, and saw her meet Ethan at a small cafe on the outskirts of town. From there, they would drive to Ethan's apartment, disappearing inside for hours. Each discovery became an entry in a small, leather-bound notebook Daniel kept hidden in his office. He recorded dates, times, and locations, even noting what she wore and how long she stayed. The act of writing it all down gave him a sense of control, a way to contain the chaos growing inside him. His approach was deliberate. He wasn't gathering this information to plead with her or to save the marriage. He was collecting it for something far more calculated. As weeks passed, Daniel's life began to take on a double layer. On the surface, he was the same man, punctual, professional, calm. Underneath, he was a man consumed by betrayal, mapping out possibilities and imagining outcomes. He watched Margaret's movements with the same precision he applied to financial forecasts, every detail feeding into an unspoken plan. The photographs, the notebook, the silent surveillance. These became the foundation of what he was building in his mind. Margaret, oblivious to the extent of his awareness, continued her affair with Ethan. The secrecy seemed to energize her. She smiled more when she left the house, her mood lifting whenever her phone buzzed with a message she hurried to read in private. She didn't notice the way Daniel's eyes lingered on her a little longer than before, or how he sometimes paused at the doorway as if memorizing her expression. She saw his silence as disinterest, not realizing it was the silence of someone waiting for the perfect moment. The air between them changed, though it was subtle. Conversations became shorter, dinners quieter. Daniel no longer asked about her day, and Margaret stopped offering details. It was as if both had agreed, without saying it, to live in a strange parallel state, together but not connected. Still, beneath that fragile surface, 2 separate currents were forming. Margaret's was one of reckless passion, driven by the thrill of her secret. Daniel's was darker, more deliberate, gathering force with each passing day to be why the time autumn rolled in, The house had settled into a cold routine. The gardens still bloomed, the neighbors still waved, but inside, the distance between Margaret and Daniel had become an unspoken chasm. What neither of them knew was that this quiet season was only the calm before the storm. A calm that would soon shatter in ways neither could predict. Margaret's affair with Ethan deepened with each passing week, and the thrill of secrecy became like a drug to her. She felt alive in ways she hadn't in years, and the more she indulged, the bolder she became. No longer satisfied with hurried meetings in quiet corners of the cafe, she began spending entire afternoons with him. She used school-related events as an excuse to be away, and when that failed, she feigned illness to avoid being home. The stolen moments were intoxicating, but they were also expensive. Margaret began dipping into her joint bank account, withdrawing cash in small amounts to avoid suspicion. She used the money to pay for dinners, weekend getaways, and expensive gifts for Ethan, trying to secure his affection with each purchase. Ethan, however, had no intention of settling down. He enjoyed the attention and the benefits, but commitment was never part of his plan. While Margaret dreamed of a future with him, he kept his options open. There was always someone else in his orbit, a younger woman from his gym, an old flame who still called late at night. Margaret didn't know the full extent of his duplicity, but small clues began to emerge. She would notice unfamiliar perfume lingering on his clothes, or catch a glimpse of another woman's belongings in his apartment. Each time she brushed it aside, telling herself she was imagining things. Her tolerance began to thin the day she discovered something she couldn't explain away. While at Ethan's apartment, she spotted a pair of plane tickets sitting carelessly on the kitchen counter. They were for a trip to Mexico, dated only a month away. At first, her heart leapt at the thought that he might be planning a surprise for her, but the excitement turned to shock when she read the second passenger's name. It wasn't hers. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She left that day feeling hollow, her mind a storm of anger and desperation. Back at home, she tried to hide her unease from Daniel, who was as distant as ever. But her mind kept circling back to the tickets, to the possibility that Ethan was preparing to leave her for someone else. She felt betrayed, not just by him, but by the life she thought she was building. The frustration grew until it started to affect her decisions. She became colder toward Daniel, treating him with open disregard. She also began pressing Ethan about their future, but each time, he deflected with charm and vague promises. Margaret started to see the constraints of her life as intolerable. Divorcing Daniel would free her from the marriage, but it would come with consequences she wasn't willing to face. Daniel was careful with money, and she knew he would fight her in court, dragging her through a messy and humiliating process. Beyond that, her reputation in Eastwood would be destroyed. She had spent years crafting the image of a respectable teacher and wife. Losing that would mean losing the social standing she valued as much as the lifestyle itself. The more she thought about her options, the more her mind turned to darker possibilities. Daniel's life insurance policy loomed large in her thoughts. She knew it was worth more than $1 million, a sum that could solve all her problems at once. If Daniel were gone, she wouldn't just be free from the marriage. She would be wealthy, able to live on her terms without compromise. Ethan could be drawn back to her with that kind of security, or if not, she could start over somewhere else entirely. Meanwhile, Daniel noticed changes in Margaret's behavior but said nothing. His quiet, methodical nature masked the fact that he was already aware of much more than she realized. The photographs, the notes in his leather-bound book, the quiet following. He had been building a record of her actions for months. When she came home late, he would be waiting, calm and unreadable, letting her think he was uninterested. In truth, he was studying her, measuring her every move, and adjusting his own plans accordingly. Margaret mistook his silence for weakness, and it made her careless. She stopped hiding her absences as well as she once had, and she began speaking to Ethan more openly, even in places where someone might overhear. The longer she juggled the two men, the more entangled her life became. She was now driven less by love and more by a stubborn need to control the outcome. She wasn't going to lose to Daniel, and she wasn't going to be discarded by Ethan. By the end of winter, the house felt colder than ever. The warmth of their marriage had long vanished, replaced by an air of quiet hostility. Daniel's sharp eyes followed Margaret without her knowing, and her thoughts, though hidden behind a practiced smile, were becoming darker and more dangerous. The stage was set for a choice she could never come back from, and once she stepped onto that path, there would be no turning around. Margaret's thoughts turned obsessive. What had begun as idle speculation about Daniel's life insurance policy became a carefully constructed plan. She immersed herself in research, starting cautiously with vague online searches about herbal remedies and illnesses, then moving into more dangerous territory. Late at night, when Daniel was asleep, she read about toxins that could be slipped into food or drink without altering the taste or smell. She learned which substances could mimic natural illnesses, making death appear sudden yet medically explainable. Her reading shifted from curiosity to strategy, each fact becoming a piece of the method she was building in her mind. She settled on a particular poison for its subtlety. In small doses, it caused symptoms easily attributed to stress, overwork, or an undiagnosed condition. Over time, it could weaken the body without drawing suspicion, eventually leading to organ failure. It was the kind of poison that left minimal traces if not specifically tested for, and she believed no one would think to look for it. The plan was simple. She would add it to Daniel's nightly herbal tea. The ritual was a comfort to him, something he drank without fail, which made it the perfect vehicle. Margaret began slowly, introducing the poison in quantities so small Daniel wouldn't notice. The first time she slipped it into his tea, her hands shook as she stirred, but Daniel drank it without hesitation. Over the next week, she repeated the process, always watching for any change. Soon, Daniel began to complain of headaches and fatigue. He moved more slowly, and his concentration seemed to falter. He mentioned feeling dizzy on several occasions, and Margaret masked her satisfaction with feigned concern. She encouraged him to rest more, to avoid the doctor, and to let her handle household responsibilities. Her confidence grew as the weeks passed. She kept her dosing inconsistent to mimic the unpredictability of illness. Daniel's appearance began to change. His skin paled, dark circles formed under his eyes, and he lost weight. Friends and neighbors commented on his tired look, but he dismissed it, attributing everything to work stress. Margaret pretended to fuss over him, ensuring his tea was always ready in the evenings. Each cup brought her closer to the freedom. She imagined at some point, she decided to involve Ethan. She believed telling him about her plan would excite him, perhaps even make him more committed to her. One afternoon, she hinted at the idea, testing his reaction. Ethan didn't discourage her, but he didn't promise anything either. Instead, he listened, storing the information away. What Margaret didn't see was the calculation in his eyes. The knowledge gave him leverage, something he could use if the situation ever turned against him. Her trust in Ethan blinded her to the risks of sharing such details. She saw him as her future, not as someone who might betray her. She began speaking more openly, not realizing that every word was placing her in greater danger. Ethan's interest in her plan wasn't driven by loyalty. It was fueled by curiosity and the potential to benefit if her scheme succeeded. By early spring, Daniel's decline was noticeable to everyone. He moved with a sluggishness foreign to the man who had always been precise and energetic. His colleagues noticed errors in his work, and he began missing days at the office. Margaret saw this as progress, but she grew impatient. The slow pace frustrated her, and she considered increasing the dosage. She knew there was a risk, but the thought of waiting months to see results was intolerable. One night, she prepared the tea with a slightly heavier hand, watching closely as Daniel drank it. He complained of feeling worse the next morning, but still didn't seek medical help. Margaret was both relieved and emboldened. She felt in control, certain that no one would suspect her. Yet Daniel was not as oblivious as she believed. Small details had caught his attention. The way she lingered when preparing his tea, the almost eager way she brought it to him, the faint bitterness in the taste on certain nights. Quietly, he began pouring the tea away when she wasn't looking, collecting samples in a sealed container. He didn't reveal his suspicions, keeping up the act of the ailing husband. Margaret remained unaware that the game she thought she was winning was being played on both sides. In her mind, she was moving toward a clean escape, but in reality, the trap she had set for Daniel was slowly closing around her instead. Each cup of tea she prepared, Each measured dose she slipped in was no longer a step toward freedom. It was evidence, gathering silently against her that Daniel's health, or at least the version of it he allowed others to see, continued to worsen. He moved deliberately, his posture slightly hunched, his voice carrying the weight of exhaustion. Friends expressed concern. Colleagues urged him to see a doctor, but he brushed it off with polite deflections. Margaret watched this performance and believed it was the natural progression of her work, never suspecting that he was now in complete control of the situation. Each night, when she brought him the familiar steaming mug of tea, he accepted it with quiet gratitude. Once she left the room, he poured it into a small glass vial he kept hidden in his desk, replacing the contents with plain tea he brewed for himself. Over time, the collection of vials grew, each labeled with the date and time, a private archive of her intent. He also began keeping meticulous notes. What Margaret thought was his declining memory was actually careful observation disguised as forgetfulness. He documented the subtle bitterness of certain cups, the color and scent of the tea, and any unusual sensations he experienced before he stopped drinking it entirely. When he had enough samples, he reached out discreetly to an old friend-in-law. Enforcement, someone he trusted to act without tipping off Margaret. Toxicology tests confirmed his suspicion. The tea contained a slow-acting poison, exactly as he feared. While the evidence built quietly in the background, Daniel made other preparations. He visited his attorney under the guise of updating his will and adjusted the beneficiary on his life insurance policy. Margaret, who had been counting on that payout, would receive nothing. Instead, the policy would pass to a distant cousin, a decision that ensured her motive would be exposed if anything happened to him. The attorney was instructed to hold this change in strict confidence until the time was right. Margaret, oblivious to these developments, grew more reckless. She had convinced herself that Daniel was too ill and too distracted to notice anything. She spent more time with Ethan, speaking to him about the life they would have once her husband was gone. She talked about selling the house, moving to a warmer climate, and living without the constraints of secrecy. Each time she painted this picture, Ethan listened, but his enthusiasm was never as bright as hers. He was calculating, weighing the benefits of staying involved against the danger of being tied to her crime. Daniel kept his own calculations running in parallel. He knew that confronting her directly could trigger panic, making her more dangerous. Instead, he chose to let her believe she was winning. He maintained the facade of a man growing weaker by the day, careful never to act in a way that might reveal his strength or his knowledge. Every look of concern she gave him, every gentle touch meant to disguise her malice, only steeled his resolve. The turning point came when Daniel decided he had gathered enough evidence. The collection of poisoned tea samples, his detailed notes, and the toxicology reports formed an airtight case. He arranged one final test, taking the most recent vial to the police himself. The results came back quickly. There was no room for doubt. Armed with this, law enforcement began preparing a warrant on the night before her arrest. Margaret decided the time had come for the final dose. She prepared the tea with unusual care, using more poison than ever before. She felt a rush of anticipation, believing she was hours away from the end of her marriage and the beginning of her freedom. She carried the mug to Daniel, watching as he took it in his hands. He gave her a faint, tired smile, one she interpreted as weakness but was, in truth, the calm before his final move. When she left the room, he poured the tea into his vial for the last time. The next morning, Daniel left the house early, telling Margaret he had an appointment at the office. Instead, he met with the detectives who had been quietly following the case. Within hours, they had the signed warrant and a team ready to move. Margaret spent that morning tidying the kitchen and checking her phone for messages from Ethan, completely unaware of the storm closing in around her. When the knock came at the door, it was sharp and deliberate. She opened it expecting a delivery or a neighbor, only to find uniformed officers and plainclothes detectives on the porch. The warrant was read, and the kitchen where she had mixed so many cups of poisoned tea became the scene of a search. Vials, receipts, and her internet history were seized. Her calm exterior began to fracture as the weight of the situation pressed in, though she still clung to the belief that she could talk her way out of it. Daniel did not return home until the search was well underway. He stood in the driveway, silent, as Margaret was let out in handcuffs. There was no confrontation, no words exchanged. Only the cold reality that the game they had both been playing was now over, and only one of them had won. Margaret was booked into the county jail before nightfall. The headlines were immediate and ruthless, splashing her face across local news with phrases like "murder plot foiled" and "teacher accused of poisoning husband." The community of Eastwood, which had once admired her, turned sharply. Neighbors whispered, parents at the school expressed shock, and colleagues who had once praised her professionalism now avoided even saying her name. In the cold confines of her cell, she replayed the events in her mind, trying to understand how everything had slipped from her control. She told herself there had to be a way out, that perhaps the evidence wasn't as strong as they claimed. But the truth was already stacked against her. The investigation moved quickly. Detectives pieced together the case with precision. The vials Daniel had collected were central, each one tested and confirmed to contain the same rare, slow-acting poison. His meticulous notes became a timeline of her actions, paired with receipts for the purchase of ingredients she had assumed were untraceable. Her internet search history, painstakingly recovered even after she tried to delete it, painted an undeniable picture of intent. The more investigators dug, the more her plan unraveled. Then came the blow she didn't anticipate. Ethan Price, the man she believed would stand beside her, had gone to the police. He offered them text messages and emails where she had openly described her intentions, sometimes in chilling detail. He even provided recordings, conversations she didn't know he had captured, where she outlined exactly how she planned to kill Daniel and what she would do afterward. In exchange for his cooperation, prosecutors granted him immunity. Ethan walked away untouched, his role neatly erased from the official charges, while Margaret was left to carry the full weight of the crime. Her trial began 3 months later. The courtroom was packed on the first day, filled with reporters, curious locals, and those who had once been part of her daily life. Daniel sat near the front, calm and composed, his presence a silent statement of survival. The prosecution wasted no time laying out the evidence: poison tea samples, bank withdrawals, incriminating messages, and expert testimony on the toxin's effects. They built a case that left little room for doubt, framing her as methodical, deceitful, and willing to kill for money and freedom. Margaret's defense tried to cast doubt on Daniel's credibility, suggesting that he had fabricated the story out of spite over her affair. But the scientific evidence was too strong. Each poison sample had been tested by independent laboratories, each search term and purchase meticulously documented. The jury listened, stone-faced, as the prosecution played Ethan's recordings, her voice steady and unapologetic as she spoke of dosage and timing. As the trial unfolded, Margaret's composure began to crack. She stopped meeting Daniel's eyes, her once confident posture curling inward. When Ethan took the stand, his smooth, rehearsed testimony painted him as a reluctant participant, a man who had stepped forward out of moral obligation. She could see the lie in every word, but the jury saw only a witness who appeared cooperative and sincere. His betrayal cut deeper than she expected, not just because he had abandoned her, but because he had ensured she stood alone. After 2 weeks of testimony, the case went to the jury. It took them less than a day to return with a verdict. The foreman stood and delivered the words she had dreaded but had known were inevitable: guilty on all counts: attempted murder, possession of a controlled substance, and conspiracy. The sentencing came swiftly. The judge, unmoved by pleas for leniency, ordered her to serve life in prison without the possibility of parole. The day she was transported to the state penitentiary, the sky over Eastwood was clear and bright, a sharp contrast to the weight pressing down on her. She kept her eyes forward, refusing to look at the cluster of reporters waiting outside. Somewhere beyond them, Daniel watched from a distance, his expression unreadable. There was no satisfaction in his gaze, only the quiet finality of a man who had survived by staying 2 steps ahead. Ethan vanished from Eastwood soon after, leaving no forwarding address. Rumors followed him, whispers of his involvement that could never be proven, but legally, his record remained clean. Daniel sold the Collins home within months, moving to another state to start over. The garden that had once been Margaret's pride grew wild. The white fence faded, and the shutters peeled under the SUN in the years that followed. The story of Margaret Collins became a cautionary tale in Eastwood. People spoke of her with a mixture of disbelief and fascination, recalling how the woman they thought they knew had hidden such darkness beneath her polished exterior. The once perfect image of the Collins marriage now existed only in memory, replaced by the enduring reminder that even the calmest surfaces can hide the most dangerous intentions.